Welcome to the video tutorial Systematic Literature Review Explanatory Notes. This short tutorial has been prepared to provide you with a concise overview of systematic literature reviews. The following topics are addressed: definition, delineation, origin, process steps, structure, selected examples, structure of the chapter method, synthesis of results. The video tutorial will be concluded by a list of references and an imprint. How can systematic literature review be defined? A systematic literature review is an autonomous method for the systematic collection and qualitative or quantitative analysis of publications and/or studies related to a research problem entailing a pre-formulated research question with one or more of the following objectives: assessment of the state of knowledge, that is, the theoretical background, identification of contradictions and/or gaps in research, description of an evolution, that is, the historical development. How can systematic literature review be delineated? Literature reviews typically occur in the form of narrative literature reviews. Systematic literature reviews must be distinguished from these. Systematic literature review can be differentiated from narrative literature review by a range of characteristics. Subject area. Narrative literature review targets broad subject areas, whereas systematic literature review addresses narrow subject areas. Question. Narrative literature review is conducted if the research question is of a relatively broad nature, whereas systematic literature review is appropriate when working on a specific research question. Own knowledge. For narrative literature review, a limited prior knowledge is sufficient, whereas systematic literature review requires sufficient prior knowledge. Search strategy. During narrative literature review, the search strategy may be erratic and drifting, whereas systematic literature review requires a structured and criterion-based search process. Traceability. Narrative literature review is conducted without documenting search results, whereas systematic literature review requires the meticulous documentation of search results. Where was the systematic literature review originally developed? The concept of systematic literature review was designed by the Cochrane collaboration. It served as a tool for the preparation, updating, and maintenance of systematic reviews for the evaluation of medical therapies. Further details are found at www.cochrane.org. Originally developed in the health sciences, the method has since been adapted by other disciplines, among others in educational sciences, psychology, social and economic sciences. What are the process steps of systematic literature review? First, a research question is formulated. This is followed by a definition of inclusion and exclusion criteria. Then, a search strategy for literature databases or other data sources is formulated. Thereafter, articles and studies using the inclusion and exclusion criteria are identified. This is followed by a documentation of the results after application of the search strategy, for example, hits in the form of tables and graphics. The next step is the identification of qualitative information or quantitative data from the included literature or studies. In professional research projects, an additional assessment of the methodological quality of the included literature or studies is required. The essential process step involves the qualitative or quantitative synthesis of the results. The process is concluded by documenting the results of the synthesis in an organized and structured way. Which structure does the documentation of a systematic literature review follow? The structuring of a documented systematic literature review generally corresponds with the structuring technique AILMDRD. IMRAD is a commonly applied approach of structuring a research paper. IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. A research paper structured according to the IMRAD approach has 4 main sections. Depending on the institutional circumstances, these 4 sections might either be exactly named Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion, or might carry individually formulated headings. What are essential aspects of the IMRAD approach? The structure has its origins in the field of life sciences. Consequently, the IMRAD approach describes and prescribes a certain logical flow of the research process, which is common in natural sciences. It has been adopted in social sciences such as psychology, sociology, and educational sciences. Furthermore, it is applied in certain fields of business sciences. As mentioned before, the IMRAD approach is primarily suitable for empirical research. This encompasses quantitative and qualitative research approaches, as well as experimental research designs. The IMRAD approach is recommended by academic associations, as for example the American Psychological Association. In many cases, the IMRAD approach is the mandatory standard for articles to be published in academic journals. As explained, the basic IMRAD approach encompasses the sections Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. In addition, there are several variations derived from the IMRAD approach. The variation AILMDRD emphasizes the importance of an abstract, which might be a mandatory component depending on the institutional requirements. AILMDRD is a further variation establishing a chapter entitled Literature or Literature Review related to the research problem. AILDMRAD is a variation that incorporates an additional chapter, Data. Please note that this is not a comprehensive list. There are more combinations derived from the basic IMRAD approach. Systematic literature review follows the structuring technique of the more elaborated IMRAD variation AILDMRD. Its components can be described as follows. The abstract is a self-contained text that provides an abridged version of the research project. The chapter introduction introduces the research problem, stating aims and research questions, as well as the course of investigation. The chapter literature is a theoretical reflection of the academic status quo that in some cases leads to a deduction of one or more hypotheses. In most cases, the chapter literature implies a narrative literature review. The chapter data is a description of the data sets that have been generated or collected in primary research or used in secondary research. The chapter methods is a description of the empirical methods that have been used in order to test the hypotheses. The chapter results serves as an unbiased presentation of the findings without an interpretation. The chapter discussion is a summary of the research project encompassing an interpretation of the results, a critical acclaim, and an outlook. How is the AILMDRD structure modified for systematic literature reviews? The structuring norms of AILDMRD can be adapted to the method of systematic literature review. The elements, abstract and introduction, remain unchanged. The elements literature and data are transformed to 1 or 2 chapters that present the empirical background and/or describe the theoretical framework. The design depends on the context of the research project. Where appropriate, the elements can be presented in 2 chapters. The element methods remains unchanged. However, since the systematic literature review is a single method, the chapter title is singular. In many cases, the elements, results, and discussion are transformed into 1 chapter, which contains a context-related discussion of the results. However, in the case of quantitative data, it could be helpful to split the presentation into 2 chapters. In this case, the numerical results would be presented in an isolated form first, before a separated discussion of these results takes place. The element conclusion remains unchanged. How is a systematic literature review conducted? This can be demonstrated by the following example. The topic of our first example is strict subsidiarity principle or state failure, a systematic literature review of the emergence of private universities in the city-state of Hamburg. The research question to be examined is, how is the emergence of private university courses received in literature? The journal article is structured as follows. Chapter 1, Introduction. Chapter 2, Empirical Situation in the City-State of Hamburg. Chapter 3, Theoretical Evaluation of State Policies in Higher Education. Chapter 4, Methodical Procedure. Chapter 5, Results. Chapter 6, Summary and Critical Acclaim. The second chapter, Empirical Situation in the City-State of Hamburg, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 2.1, Emergence of Private Universities. Subchapter 2.2, Costs of Private University Studies. Subchapter 2.3, Demand for State Courses of Study. The third chapter, Theoretical Evaluation of State Policies in Higher Education, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 3.1, Subsidiarity Principle. Subchapter 3.2, Government Failure. The fifth chapter, Results, is broken down as follows. Subchapter 5.1, State Failure as a Normative Value Pattern. Subchapter 5.2, Regulatory Sovereignty instead of Production Monopoly. Subchapter 5.3, Positive Externalities as a Privatization Argument. Subchapter 5.4, Returns to Education as an Argument for Privatization. The proceedings of a systematic literature review should be demonstrated by a further example. The topic of example 2 is The Big Short, a systematic literature review on the causes of the subprime crisis as cited in popular literature. The research question to be examined is, to what extent are the causes of the subprime crisis cited in Michael Lewis' The Big Short confirmed by scientific research? The bachelor thesis is structured as follows. Chapter 1, Introduction. Chapter 2, Subprime Crisis. Chapter 3, Method. Chapter 4, Analysis and Discussion. Chapter 5, Summary and Critical Acclaim. The second chapter, Subprime Crisis, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 2.1, Origin. Subchapter 2.2, Contagion. Subchapter 2.3, Effects. The fourth chapter, Analysis and Discussion, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 4.1, Policy of the Fed. Subchapter 4.2, Regulatory Disincentives. Subchapter 4.3, Malpractice of Rating Agencies. Subchapter 4.4, Too Big to Fail and Moral Hazard. Subchapter 4.5, Global Interdependence of Financial System. Subchapter 4.6, Investment Banking Culture. The proceedings of a systematic literature review should be demonstrated by a third example. The topic of example 3 is Market Perception of Hybrid Bonds, Equity or Debt. The research question to be examined is, what determines the market perception of hybrid bonds as equity or debt? The term paper is structured as follows. Chapter 1, Introduction. Chapter 2, Hybrid Bonds. Chapter 3, Method. Chapter 4, Analysis and Discussion. Chapter 5, Summary and Critical Acclaim. The second chapter, Hybrid Bonds, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 2.1, Definition. Subchapter 2.2, Structural Features. Subchapter 2.3, Market Status. The fourth chapter, Analysis and Discussion, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 4.1, Perception of Subordination. Subchapter 4.2, Return Expectation. Subchapter 4.3, Rating Leverage. The proceedings of a systematic literature review should be demonstrated by another example. The topic of example 4 is private debt funds as market disruption. The research question to be examined is, to which degree can private debt funds be classified as market disruption according to Christensen's definition? The term paper is structured as follows. Chapter 1, Introduction. Chapter 2, Market Disruption according to Christensen. Chapter 3, Private Debt Funds as Alternative Financing Method. Chapter 4, Systematic Literature Review. Chapter 5, Analysis and Discussion. Chapter 6, Summary and Critical Acclaim. The second chapter, Market Disruption according to Christensen, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 2.1, Disruptive Innovation. Subchapter 2.2, Identification. The third chapter, Private Debt Funds as Alternative Financing Method, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 3.1, Private Debt and Private Debt Funds. Subchapter 3.2, The Market. The fifth chapter, Analysis and Discussion, is further broken down as follows. Subchapter 5.1, Reasons for Disruption. Subchapter 5.2, Criteria for Disruptive Innovation. How could the chapter method be structured? The following explanations are of an exemplary nature. The chapter method could also be structured differently. For example, for shorter research papers, the subchapters presented below could be combined. On the one hand, a subchapter Systematic Literature Review serves to explain the method in general. Moreover, the specific research strategy is explained. A subchapter, Sources of Data, could list the accessed library databases. A subchapter, Inclusion and Exclusion Criteria, could describe the topic-related delineation of the search strategy. A subchapter, Search Terms and Filters, is used to present search terms and filters. Typically, the literature search results are presented in tables. The review of results is used in order to delineate the review process. A subchapter, Abstract Review, describes which texts were selected for a full review based on their abstracts. A subchapter, Full Text Review, describes which texts were selected for further analysis based on a full review. In some cases, additional sources are used. This is an optional subchapter, for example utilized in case of an additional web search. Two principles must be strictly observed when writing the chapter. Only the methodical procedure is described. The chapter contains no description of material content. How can inclusion and exclusion criteria be presented? Inclusion and exclusion criteria should be selected according to the research question and context. The formal criteria may relate to the language of publication, the place of publication, the type of publication, the publication date, the availability in electronic or physical form, etc. Additionally, material criteria related to the topic at hand should be formulated. Formal and material inclusion and exclusion criteria can be presented in a table. How can search terms and filters be presented? The selection of the used keywords should be explained coherently in the text. In some cases, it may be useful to present the keywords again in summarized form in a table. This will be particularly useful if the research questions are broken down into sub-questions or if hypotheses are formed which are to be examined separately. The applied filters can also be displayed in a table. How could literature search results be presented? The overall results of the literature search, and in particular the elimination of irrelevant sources, can be illustrated graphically. The individual steps can then be presented in more detailed tables, which can be included in the appendix of the paper in order to avoid overloading the text body. How can results be derived, synthesized from the body of literature? The systematic research and selection of literature has a distinctly technical character and is often a lengthy and strenuous work. On the other hand, the analysis of the selected body of literature and the synthesis of results can be intellectually enriching and very satisfying. After all, the aim is to find answers to the research question in an investigative and creative way. As explained earlier, the synthesis can be quantitative when reviewing data-driven studies and qualitative when reviewing more text-based sources. The world of qualitative empirical research techniques is diverse, complex, and has its own toolbox of methods, the explanation of which would go beyond the scope of our tutorial. At this point, it is sufficient to consider two intuitively understandable aspects. First, the qualitative analysis follows an explorative approach, and second, it applies inductive reasoning. Explorative approach implies the identification of one or more arguments made by one or more authors that correspond to the problem. Inductive reasoning means arguments are aggregated or grouped to categories that represent the conclusion of the systematic literature review. The result of this process can then be documented for each individual topic and corresponding subchapters, as it is shown once again for the first example presented earlier.